What's up, everyone? Welcome. We are live right now on Cannabis, and if you're joining us on YouTube or the podcast universe out there, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the show. We have a great one for you today. We are going to be talking with Bio365's Sebastian. So if you are a soil grower or you want to kind of venture into that world, we've got an interesting conversation today. Bio365 is something that JR's been using a lot of recently and having a lot of success. So I know he's excited about this show. He's put a lot of good questions together. But before we get too far into it, I need to make a couple shout outs. First off, shout out to everyone in the Cannabis community. If you enjoy our podcasts, if you enjoy the stuff that we put out there, you can support us by joining our members only community. Go to cannabis.app in your browser, use the code BUZZ for your first month free, and after that, you can support us for as little as $4.20 a month. But your support helps us go to events like we went to Emerald Cup earlier this year. We're planning to go again next year. And so your support helps us do things like that and other cool stuff. And we really appreciate your support and everyone in there. And for those supporters, they can join us in the live stream when we do these interviews. And JR is going to do a giveaway. So that's another perk for being a member of Cannabis. Sometimes you get to win some giveaways. But another couple of shout outs before I throw it over to JR. Shout outs to SacredThreeMushrooms.com. If you want to grow your own fungi at home, say you want to grow some edible mushrooms. I went to the farmer's market the other day and you see all these like beautiful things that you can get out there. It's really cool. You can grow your own at home with these fungi grow kits. Go to SacredThreeMushrooms.com. You get a like shoebox size kit for about $80. It's got everything you need and then some. They've got all sorts of resources over there, and you can use the code CANNABUZZ for 10% off. And then shout out to lostcoastplanttherapy.com. I've been using Lost Coast lately. Had an aphid issue pop up all of a sudden, weirdly enough, in December. And so I've been using Lost Coast Plant Therapy, and it's been really helpful. So check out lostcoastplanttherapy.com or find them on Amazon or wherever, and give a shout out to Dirk for his support. And then JR, I'll throw it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Q. Yeah, and I'll kind of shout out Lost Coast as well. Dirk has signed on for another year of sponsorship for the show because he believes in what we do and he believes in the community. So shout out to Dirk and Lost Coast. Also shout out today to Tiki and Brad from Raw. Both those guys have signed on for sponsorship for the show. And I've been working with Brad for about a decade or over a decade now, growing all of his awesome varieties. For the Tiki announcement, we're doing the Pablo's Revenge at his TikiCuts.com. TikiCuts has got a buy one, get one, and he has some really, really excellent breeder cuts there that have been selected and are amazing. I also want to talk about Raw. Raw Genetics has their Blue Slushies box set, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different varieties that have all been crossed with the blue slushies. And one of them is the Frozen Paloma, which is Cherry Paloma by Blue Slushies. Nice. So that one's going to be incredible. So that's at rawgenetics.io.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you to everyone who's been supporting us. Well, let's get into the show. Today we have Sebastian. He's Bio365's Western Regional Support Manager. Super excited to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank
Sebastian.
you. Yeah. Awesome to be here. Most appreciated. It's really great. Thank you, JR. Thank you, Sam. It's wonderful to be here.
Excellent. Well, we always, when we get new guests on, friends of the show, we always like to ask you how you fell in love with the plant and how the plant's gotten you where you are today.
Oh, thanks for that question. So I first encountered cannabis when I was around 15 in school. And, I remember the first time that I smoked and got high, and it was just an incredible ecstatic experience. It really was life-changing for me. And from then on, I was always fascinated with it as a plant. I always grew things prior to introducing myself to cannabis. And then once I started to grow cannabis, it was just such an extraordinary plant, so rewarding, the way it grows, how quickly it grows. And then plus you get this incredible these incredible flowers at the end. So I was just totally in love and kind of entranced by the plant and all of its extraordinary cultivars and its ability to change and diversify itself over time. It's just extraordinary. And then as I've grown older and utilized it in different ways, I've really come to have a really, really deep respect for it as a plant teacher and as a medicine, and not just as a recreational drug, but as something that's really here to teach us about how to relate to the natural world and how to relate to ourselves. And so I have a lot of respect for it as a divine plant teacher. Mostly the way that I utilize it now is through making whole flower olive oil extractions. And that's primarily what I use. I really try not to smoke anymore, just for my own lung health, whole various reasons, a lot of reasons why I choose not to smoke. But that said, I occasionally hit a joint, and there's nothing better than the taste of some really high terpene flower. I love the fact that people are really beginning to understand how important that is, and that the word is getting out to people in terms of the consumer base of cannabis, that it's not just about having these frosty hard nugs. It's really about what the taste is and how it smells and how you experience the entourage effect of all those terpenes and cannabinoids together. So I think, cannabis as a plant is incredible. It's right up there with all of the other amazing plant teachers and plant medicines. And our history of using it too, for me, is just something that's so deep and rich and should be continued. So my experience with cannabis was basically from the first time that I started to use it, I really wanted to grow it. And at that time in Australia, when you bought cannabis, it was usually outdoor grown. A lot of the times it was imported from Asia. So there was always seed in it. And, some of the most interesting strains I grew when I was younger were Thai landrace sativas, lots of mango and other strains like that. And I just actually recently found some old pictures of plants I grew back in the 90s. And, they had these really long, skinny leaves and these big open flowers. And I just remember them being incredibly, the euphoric high on that was amazing. So yeah. I had a lot of respect for that. And, looking at the genetics that the West Coast has developed over the last 20, 30 years, it's been extraordinary to see the way that all of those genes, and this is one of the things I think so extraordinary about the cannabis plant, it's convinced humans to bring it from all parts of the world to the West Coast to create incredible genetics and incredible blends that just continue to grow and grow and grow. So it's a pretty extraordinary plant. Energetically, I have a lot of respect for it.
Yeah, I'm really stoked to have you on. Were you able to get down to BizCon this year?
I did not go myself. The company went. I've been all the other years, but this year I just chose to sit it out. We didn't have a booth this year. We did a little bit of advertising at it, but part of that was we've had our team has shrunk a little bit. There's been a pretty big contraction in the market, and we've contracted with that. It's been pretty challenging for us, and we sort of tossed and turned about having a booth, and we ended up deciding not to have a booth. And I think that was probably a pretty good decision from what I hear from the people that did go. That it's a much smaller show this year. And that's good. I mean, consolidation is good. Consolidation at the expense of the original growers in the industry is not good. I just hope that people can continue to lobby for better regulation, for more retail outlets in California, for farmers markets, for things that allow small cultivators with unique genetics to get out there into the world with products that are viable and useful, and not just pharmaceutical companies that take the medical side of things into pills and other extractions that don't really represent the true medical nature of the plant.
For sure. You've hit on a bunch of topics that we could go onto rabbit holes on, but before we do,
I know I'm trying not to be triggered.
JR will go on his rant about legislation. But let's get into our different kind of mediums that you guys create. So I'm a noob to Bio365, so I'll act as like the dummy that's asking kind of a lot of the basic questions. So the first one is BioCoCo. What is BioCoCo? Kind of give me the intro, the shtick, where does it kind of fit into the grower kind of marketplace?
So the big differentiator with all of Bio365 products in the marketplace is that they are living products. So they're biologically and fungally active. Second differentiator is they're manufactured. So they're not commodity products. This is a really important point, but they're manufactured products. The manufacturing's done in a clean, consistent environment, indoors, utilizing clean, consistent inputs, which have a list of quality controls they have to pass for us before we utilize them. That's not the manufacturer's quality controls, that's our quality controls. So clean, consistent manufacturing and a living product. So we don't we don't think of them as soil so much as grow media or soilless media, because they're really combined of three things: cocoa coir, two types, long fiber or crunch cocoa, which is like a tube or a hair of cocoa, and pith, which is the finer media, which is what most, say, compressed cocos are made of. So BioCoCo has those two components, crunch, coir, and pith. The crunch, or the hair-like fibers, are like little tubules, and they'll fill up and release water and nutrient to the plant. So they have a dual purpose in the mix of creating a physical quality of high porosity, high water holding, and they make the media very light. So when you look at BioCoCo in a bag, there's only about 18% solids. The rest is air and water holding capacity. So the big difference, I think, between BioCoCo and other cocos on the market is, one, it holds a lot more water than most cocoa does. So most commodity cocos hold about 40 to 50% water. BioCoCo holds 62% water. So that's a distinct difference. The other is that it's a living cocoa, that it has embedded biological and fungal species in it. So as soon as you put a plant into that, its root hairs begin to communicate with the biological and fungal species that are in the media. And that biology and fungi is anchored through the inclusion of biochar into BioCoCo. And the way that we get biochar in is we make a product called BioCharge, which is an aged and activated conglomeration of biochar, OMRI-rated dry nutrient inputs, and our own cultured biological fungal species. So those three things are combined in an aging and activation process that lasts about 4 weeks. And what you get at the end of that is like a living, activated super soil that has biochar that anchors the nutrient and anchors the biology. And I'll come back to that and talk about it in relation to the other soils. So that biocharge is then blended with the two types of cocoa. And in that biocharge is the biochar, which provides a home for the biology and the fungi, provides a place where nutrient can attach through cation exchange. The same with the fibers of the cocoa. Cocoa has cation exchange capacity. So all of those things anchor biology in the BioCoCo. And then when you put your plant into it and it grows a root, the biology is there to communicate with the plant and to feed the plant in between your forced feedings. Especially if you're using salt, you're forcing nutrient across the root cell membrane from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. And then once that evens out and you get an osmotic balance, then the plant can begin to select through signaling to the biology and the fungi what nutrients it actually wants. So you get force feeding, and then you get luxury consumption, where the plant begins to say, well, I'd actually like some more calcium or some more phosphorus. I don't want any more nitrogen, but I want some more of these other micronutrients like iron. And the biology can then begin to deliver that to the plant. So it sort of turns on its head the way most cultivators think about growing in cocoa, which is constant feeding, constant pulse feeding. And that's a great strategy, because the plant can't say no. It can't deny that food. It just has to keep taking it in and taking it in and taking it in. Whereas with biological feeding, it gets to choose, and it gets to express itself differently according to its genetic predispositions.
That's really, can you talk about how do you suggest people feed their plants then, like the nutrients strategy? Because that's really interesting. What you're describing sounds really cool. I'm not a kind of cocoa grower myself,
Right.
but I really like what you're describing, this kind of mix of things. So how do you often suggest people approach their nutrient strategy?
Right. Well, with BioCoCo particularly, and it's different to most of the other Bio365 grow medias, we always suggest that they do a first irrigation that's a saturation irrigation with a high pH, high EC, moderate pH. So pH around 6 to 6.2, high EC probably 3.5 or 3 at least. And then you get about 5% runoff. And so that charges up the bag. Basically, it displaces any additional potassium ions that are there, charges up the cocoa, and then allow that to dry back. So this is where right at the beginning you get this challenge to the way most people are used to growing in cocoa, which is they feed, they do a saturation irrigation, and then maybe the next day they come back and they start pulse feeding, or they do another feed the next day, and then the day after that they pulse feed. With BioCoCo, we suggest you do that first feeding, and then you let that bag dry back for, depending on your environment, 3 to 5 days. That is.
Can I stop you there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because one of the problems I think people have in the living environment is that dry back and knowing how far to come back, because if you go too far back, you're damaging the biology that you've all charged up. So can you kind of talk about that balance of that
Sure.
dryback?
Absolutely. And, I think that this is where doing some experimentation on your own is really important as a cultivator, especially someone that's at home. Don't just take my word for it. Go out and research the things that I talk about. Like, one of the best ways to measure water capacity in a soil is through tension, because that's the way the plant is actually extracting moisture and nutrient from the soil. It's through tension. So what that means is the plant is sucking with its root hairs through transpiration. So you're setting up this cycle of air leaving or molecules leaving the plant, molecules being drawn into the plant. And that tension is based on how much water is available. So if there's a lot of water available, there's virtually no tension. And that's the state of most cannabis cultivation, is high water all of the time, like maybe 2 hours between a pulse feed, maybe a day, depending on who you are, maybe longer if you're growing in a big container. But if you're growing in a small container, you really don't have a lot of tension that the plant has to exert to draw that moisture and nutrient up into its body. The way you measure tension is with a tensiometer, not with a probe. A probe tends to measure through an algorithm water content, and that's a different experience altogether. I don't want to get so much into the technicalities of that because, one, I can't explain how probes work so well, but I know that they use an algorithm, and the algorithm makes a calculation for what the water holding capacity of the soil is. Now, several things can interfere with that algorithm. For example, biochar will interfere with it because biochar has an electrical charge to it. So it will upset the probe itself. So if you're going to measure with a probe, you need to make sure the probe is adjusted to measure water holding in a biochar-based soil. And most probes have that setting or have a setting you can adjust to them. The cheap ones don't, but like Arroyo systems do. So that's the big difference between measuring it. With a tensiometer, you're measuring what the plant is actually physically doing. And if you put a tensiometer in CoCo and you irrigate, you'll see that the needle doesn't really move for several days until that CoCo begins to dry back. That's when you know that the soil is actually losing moisture, and it's losing moisture through evaporation. It's losing moisture through the plant drawing it up. Now, in our CoCo, in BioCoCo, you could put a tensiometer in and not water until you reach, say, 35 or 40 kilopascals. That's moderate amount of dry back. The bag would not feel light. The bag would just seem like the CoCo on top was dry, but there'd be still plenty of moisture in that bag to drive that plant forward. And what happens is most people will see that the CoCo on the top dries back and they want to irrigate again. So they then fill up all the air-filled porosity with water. Now, the difference between porosity in soil is it's either water-filled or it's air-filled. If it's water-filled, it's waterlogged. If it's air-filled, it's empty and drying back. The plant has room to grow its roots because it won't grow roots into water-filled areas. It'll grow them into air-filled. That's what it's seeking. As it grows into that air-filled porosity, it encounters more nutrient, more biology, and begins its luxury consumption feeding cycle. So I know that was kind of a complicated explanation, but that's essentially the difference between the two types of feeding and the style of cultivation in BioCoCo.
Really interesting. Let's see. JR, you had a question about pH, I think.
Yeah. So one of the things that kind of happens when you get those dry backs and you are kind of playing around with that is sometimes your pH swings can go weird. And then you have some kind of nutrient lockouts, usually like a calcium or a mag thing.
Yeah.
Can you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yes, sure. So because Bio365's grow media are living grow media, there's a natural amount of pH buffering that happens with the biology and the fungi. Basically, they kind of take the place of you having to balance the pH in order to deliver nutrient. So the nutrient will be delivered through the biology, not through the correct pH. So most of what we do with hydroponic cultivation or force feeding salt nutrient is we want to get the pH into a space where all the nutrients are available and they're not locked out. So when you have biology and fungi there, you don't have to operate through that window because the biology is feeding the nutrient to the plant or the biology is making the nutrient available. Now, what often happens is when people over irrigate the soil, you get what looks like lockout, but it's really just excess water. The plant can't take up the nutrient because it's drowning in too much irrigation. So the similarity between what looks like lockout or under-fertilization and overwatering is very common. Now, I'm not saying that's what happens in most CoCos, but it's easy to do. And I always recommend that people start our CoCo where they feel comfortable. And then if the cocoa begins to drop in pH, to adjust accordingly the input pH. So we recommend an input pH of between 6 and 6.5 pH, but we know most people are going to do 5.6 or 5.7 or 5.8. And then if the pH really drops over time, then they just need to adjust their input pH. So it's not vastly different from other cocos, but it's not essential that you have to be rigid about how you control your pH.
Do you find that people have that learning curve about reducing their nutrient input because they are in a living system?
Yes and no, but I think it's really important to be careful with that idea that just because you have a living system that you can reduce nutrient input. Because what I experience here is often people are like, oh, I don't have to irrigate as much, so I won't increase my nutrient to compensate for the lack of irrigation that I'm doing. So often people say, oh, I don't have to irrigate for a week. Well, I'll only give one irrigation, and they give it at 1.8 EC when really they needed to do twice that, because they're still delivering the same amount of nutrient. It's just over a longer period of time through lesser irrigation frequency. So that's something that you have to be really careful about. When you start to talk about working with BioFlower, BioAll, that's a little bit different because the nutrients are in the soil. So you don't have to do additional fertigation or be concerned about lack of nutrient. One thing I do notice in a lot of our nutrient light media is that people will, coupled with the water holding capacity of the soil, think that they can irrigate less and then end up under fertilizing. So we really recommend in our quick start guide for BioCoCo that you come in at an EC of like minimum 2.5 to 3.0 EC. I've done plenty of my own growing with that and start at a higher level. I know a lot of people in the industry who are really doing a lot of forced generative growth, and they're using really high ECs for that. And that's great. The plant, if it doesn't wash out the bottom, the plant's not going to use it once it gets a balance between the osmotic potential and the actual osmotic solution.
Awesome. Well, we're gonna talk about BioStart in a second, but before we do, I was thinking about, so how do I reuse BioCoCo, or can I? Because what you were describing earlier, that with all the beneficials that you're adding and everything like that, I was kind of thinking, well, how do I reuse it? Do I need to kind of use the biocharge again, or how do you do that?
Well, that's a great question. And I really appreciate that, because it's something that we don't talk enough about in the industry. And I'm certainly not, as a salesperson, encouraged to encourage people to reuse their media. But just in general, I have some great stories about individuals who reuse BioCoCo, for example, in a 3-gallon pot, like 11 times, just coring out the basic root stalk and putting another clone in there and reusing it with salt, and having a great experience. Now, that said, I don't actually think if you're using salt nutrients that you need to do a lot to the BioCoCo in between rounds. You could certainly use some enzymes to help break down the root mass and make it available to the next plant that's coming in. But when you think about the life cycle of a cannabis plant indoors, it's fairly short. And I haven't done any tests on this, but I don't know how long it would take for biology or enzymes to break down that root matter and make that nutrient available to plants, but it may be not within the life cycle of the cannabis plant that's flowering again. But what it does is help clean the soil out. So helps keep the balance of biology and fungi going. I think it's always a good idea to consider, what does the biology and fungi in the soil need to survive and to increase its communities. So maybe adding something that is feeding some of that biology. So maybe some carbohydrates or some sugars of some kind.
Awesome. Thank you. I had a question come in from chat that I wanted to ask you before we get into BioStart. So this is, again, shout out to our Cannabis supporters, folks who love the channel, love the podcast, or and want to support us. You can do that at cannabis.app, or download the Cannabis app in the browser, or sorry, in your app store. But anyways, the question is from DK. They asked, what is EC or AC? So that's a good question. We were using some terminology earlier when you were talking about feeding and stuff like that. So can you explain that before we move forward?
Yeah, so EC basically refers to electrical conductivity. So it's what's the ionic content of a liquid. So if you put a probe in, the probe is actually measuring how many ions are in that liquid. It's not telling you what they are. It doesn't tell you whether it's phosphorus or potassium or nitrogen or iron or calcium or whatever it is. It just tells you that there's this many ions on a logarithmic scale according to what's in that liquid. Whereas ppm is parts per million. It's a different way of measuring. It's measuring the same kind of things, measuring the ions in the water. It's another way of calculating it. So when you use an EC probe, you can't really tell what is actually in your nutrient solution in terms of the breakdown of the nutrients themselves. You can only tell what the concentration of the ions of the nutrients are. So if you're using a salt-based nutrient system, you're relying on the manufacturer's allocation of nutrients and percentages of nutrients within that solution.
Awesome. JR, kick us off with the BioStart section.
Yeah, so I always find it interesting when folks offer a starting medium for propagation and stuff. And so I noticed that your BioStart looked really interesting. And this is another topic that we haven't really touched on here in Cannabis. And I thought while we had your butt in the chair, you'd be the perfect person to talk to about it. So one of the things I've always kind of been wrapping my mind around is those early introductions of your microbials. Like, I know you really want to introduce your fungi early, so that they can start growing with the root system as it continues to do its thing. And so one of the things I noticed is that one of the questions is about germination and how that microbial presence you have kind of helps that whole process kind of kickstart and get going.
Right. So, one of the questions you asked me was, does BioStart influence the microbial dynamics during germination of the cannabis seeds? Well, I can't really say that it influences germination simply because it's not connecting with the plant itself until it actually has a root hair into the soil. So that's the first place that the biological fungal matrix in BioStart would begin to influence the plant's growth and the plant's nutrient cycling and activity. So what would happen there, as soon as that little initial root comes out into the soil and puts a root hair into the soil, it begins to communicate with the fungi, the mycorrhizal material in the soil and the biology, and begins to get fed what it needs. Now, the beauty of something like BioStart or BioGreens, which is another starting soil we have but has a higher nutrient content than BioStart, is that all of that nutrient is bioavailable to the plant immediately that it gets that root in the soil. So you don't have to think about, oh, what do I need to deliver in terms of NPK to this little seedling? All you have to think about is what's the moisture content of the soil and how much warmth is it getting and how much light does it need right away? And then once it has leaves, how much am I going to boost that light and when do I need to start supplemental feeding? So in something like BioStart, the main thing would be to not overwater that in the beginning, just to utilize it with a small amount of water so it's damp but not moist, and then allow that seed to really express its roots out into that soil super quickly. And once it does that, it's going to contact all the biology and fungi, begin to feed, begin to grow, and establish a really healthy root system. Now, the big difference between BioStart and, say, other soils like BioAll is it's made up of really fine coconut coir, peat, and perlite. So it has a different physical porosity to the soils with larger components. So BioAll, for example, has much bigger pieces of peat, cocoa, and perlite in it. Now, it really is a starting soil. It's designed to go into trays and fill up small cell size trays and used in ELIPOT machines. And that's what it's designed for. It's not really designed for necessarily putting in like a 1 gallon container. It's really designed for much smaller containers where the plant's only going to be in that container for a week or so.
Well, for a lot of the folks that, in our community, a lot of us start in solo cups, and so having that kind of balanced thing where we have to do, like you said, is worry about our environmental parameters and our watering. That takes a lot of it out because that's a very delicate and fragile stage that, I personally I screw it up all the time. And I've been doing this for 25 years.
Yeah.
It's just to be able to have a starting medium that will kind of give you that edge of success. It's kind of worth a little bit of the investment, especially, if you're paying, $100 for a 10-pack of seeds,
Absolutely.
you don't want those to not be successful.
Yeah, I was just at the Topinami event in San Francisco yesterday, down in the dog patch, and like I was looking at some of the seed prices there, and some people had some specialty packs for $500, and I was like, damn, I wouldn't want to lose those seeds by putting them in some crappy soil, or forgetting that I had them between pieces of paper, and they got too dry or something. So yeah, I think that's a great solution to thinking about how to germinate seeds. But I would honestly, if you're growing in solo cups, I would probably use BioAll, just because I think it has a little bit more nutrient than BioStart, and you could leave that plant in that solo cup for a longer period of time.
But don't ever do that.
Don't ever do that. Leave it in the long period of time.
No. Don't ever do that. We don't want to inhibit it in any way. We want those roots to be going as no restrictions, kids. No restrictions.
That's sorry.
Go ahead,
I heard you were at the event in SF yesterday. That's cool. I live in the Bay Area as well, so I don't that's cool. I couldn't make it, but I know that folks are there. Johnny from Huckleberry Hill Farms hit me up and he asked me if I was going. So that's cool. Let's go. Let's see. JR, well, we had one more question that I thought was interesting about BioStart. So could you talk about what's in it? JR has a note about yucca. So could you talk about why is yucca in it? What's it doing?
So that's a great question. And that was the one question out of all your questions that I had a really hard time finding an answer to. So what I understand is the yucca is used as a wetting agent because we use really fine cocoa peat products, that getting even wetting of those in the manufacturing process is really important. And so yucca is a natural wetting agent. And as we're trying to produce an organic, although we're not certified organic yet, an organic product, we're using that instead of alternate wetting agents. So that's what I understand it's being used for.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because all of our products are prehydrated. So when you buy them in a bag, they have about 30% water in them already. So you can, if you get a fresh bag of BioStart, you could plant your seeds right into that without irrigating. And then it would just be about how much compression do you use when you're putting the soil into the cell or whatever you're doing, you're starting in. But you could germinate without irrigation if it's fresh soil, and then very sparing amounts of water after that.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Well, so we're halfway through the show. If you, like me, are wondering about where I can get this stuff because I'm already intrigued, I looked up your website. So it's bio365.com, and bio365.com/store-locator is a locator. And so I see that there's several grow stores in the Bay Area, including the one that I typically go to. But so JR, kick us off into the next section.
Yeah, we might as well go ahead and move on to the BioAll. After, as you just mentioned it, and I personally have been using BioAll mixed in with my Coots mix. I wanted to add that kind of fluffiness. I wanted some more air capacity inside my mix. The Coots mix was a little bit dense, and from the way I felt like I'm going to be applying it, because I'm not doing a forever bed. So tell us kind of about BioAll and what it has to offer. And one of the first questions I want to ask is, how many weeks of nutrition are in a gallon of BioAll?
Great question. It depends a little bit on the size of the plant you're putting in it. Okay, so say you have a 1 gallon pot and you put a seed in that and you germinate that seed. You could grow that seed for 3 to 4 weeks in that 1 gallon pot with plenty of nutrient. It would just be moderate water, not too much. You want to let that plant really develop its root system. If you're putting a clone into a gallon container, you'd probably get 2 weeks out of it. And it's also a little bit dependent on what is your cultivation strategy, what SOPs do you have, what are you driving for in the first couple of weeks of growth? Are you really looking to push generative growth, or are you just happy for the plant to do its thing at its own pace? So I guess it depends a little bit on, what is your what are your environment, what are your circumstances, what's your light demand, all those kinds of things play into how much nutrient is there. It's more about how much can the plant extract out of what nutrient is there. How is it effectively utilizing the biology? Because if you overwater that plant, it's not going to do the extraction of the nutrient in the way that it would if you're giving it less water. Less water is really forcing the plant to run its roots through the media and connect with the biology, absorb that nutrient that's bioavailable in the soil.
I can kind of speak to my own experiences. I come out of a cloner, just an aeroponic cloner, and I go right into a 2-gallon with a BioAll.
Yeah.
And I can veg in there for about 2.5 weeks before I need to start giving it any nutrition.
Yeah.
And when I water in, I'm watering in around 400 milliliters, so it's a pretty decent watering that'll last me, 4 or 5 days, especially in the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think that I think the idea of being able to have, like, you guys offer a 3-gallon solution. I think you could get a good amount of veg nutrition out of one of those 3-gallon bags.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would totally agree with that. My experience in growing plants in veg in BioAll when I started with Bio365 in Sonoma on their research and development farm was we would transplant 1-gallon containers into 5-gallon containers of BioAll. We'd get like 8 weeks of veg in that before we really saw actual chlorophyll deficiency from using a chlorophyll meter from lack of nitrogen. So, the thing about the cannabis plant is it's a really greedy plant, and you can feed the crap out of it if you want to, but you don't have to. So that's why I say, it depends a little bit on what kind of system and protocol you're running. But, what you described, JR, is exactly what I would expect to see with BioAll in a 2-gallon container.
That's awesome. Can you talk about the kind of attributes or makeup of BioAll that supports terpene and cannabinoid development in cannabis, or kind of what's in it that brings out the best in the plant, essentially?
So there's a bunch of things, but basically, to start with, like all Bio365 soil, it's a cocoa-based media. And the base of that cocoa is the crunch, which is the long fiber that I talked to you about before. So what that long fiber does is it provides advanced porosity. The physical makeup of the soil is highly porous, along with the perlite. And that allows the plant to really run its roots quickly through the soil and develop a big root system. On top of that, the crunch cocoa has the cation exchange. So it's holding and releasing nutrient to the plant. The biochar that's in BioAll does the same thing. So it provides not only like a condo or a home for biology to live and to multiply, but it also holds water and nutrient. So in that sense, the soil has this kind of like unique capacity to hold and release water under tension over very long periods of time. So if you're growing a plant and you're really wanting to force production of terpenes and cannabinoids and flavonoids, you can really drive very, very long drybacks without the fear that you're actually going to damage the plant or damage or deplete the biology in the soil, because the biochar plus the cocoa provide access to water for both the biology, fungi, and the plant. And what that means is that even under high levels of tension, the plant can still draw water and nutrient out of the soil without getting stressed. And this is something where I think for a lot of home growers, getting a tensiometer and sticking it in your 5-gallon container and watering according to that and understanding how tension works is a really useful tool, because it'll probably show you how much water you're giving that you don't need to give and how you can really push generative growth through drybacks, so long as the nutrient is available to the plant in the soil already, that it's loaded there, whether that's through delivery in salt with salts or delivery with bioavailable nutrient in a nutrient-dense soil.
One of the strategies that I use also with the BioAll is the fact that you guys kind of chock it full of beneficial nematodes and other stuff in there that kind of make it safe in transport, So you're going to guarantee maybe that the biology inside that bag is keeping some of the pest pressures or anything that might come in check.
Yeah.
And so I'm using that inside my mix as a way of introducing that to combat any kind of fungus gnat issues I might have. So can you kind of talk about how you guys preload your mix?
Sure.
With the biology?
So I do have to just say we don't put nematodes in intentionally in the mix. What we do is because we have a two-part manufacturing process, and it's all done indoors in sealed environments. In our initial phase of aging and activation, where we make the biocharge, which is the biochar, cultured biological fungal species, and dry organic nutrient inputs, in that environment, which is in a closed room inside the facility itself with HEPA filters, it's like a lab almost. In that space, we'll often add hypoaspis mites and sometimes nematode, depending on what's going on with that aging and activation process. And what that does is that ensures that there is no infiltration from outdoors of unwanted pests and pathogens, such as fungus gnats. So when we put in our inputs into that system, we try to keep them as clean as we can before they go into that system. So we store them indoors. But, we recognize we're working with a living media. And sometimes some of the products like peat, for example, it's an organic material. It comes from a peat bog. It has spores and other things like that on it. So when we put it in our aging and activation process, we want to really make sure that there's a level of sterilization that occurs in that process. So, when you raise the temperature of composting mix to like 160 degrees or 140, 150 degrees Fahrenheit, you get a natural sterilization that occurs. And that's one of the things that we do. So we make sure that we're sterilizing and removing, or at least outcompeting, pathogenic biology, fungi, nematodes, any of those arthropods, or any of those things that you would normally find in a natural outdoor composting environment, where every kind of creature who wants to germinate a seed or an egg of itself will lay it in a compost heap. Because of that heat, it helps germinate or helps birth those new creatures. So indoors, we really try to take care of that by having a closed environment and monitoring it, and then utilizing things like hypoaspis mites to control anything. So when we put it in a bag at the end of that process, when we blend it with cocoa, peat, and perlite, put it in a bag and it's hydrated, we wrap that in plastic and we ship that to a hydroponic store or directly to you as a consumer. We guarantee that it comes to you clean and free of any of those pests, because of the way we monitor our systems, because of the way we enclose everything and keep it clean and consistent. Now, once you've had that bag and you open it up and you bring it into a room, well, that's a different matter. There's a whole lot of things that can go in there. But what you're getting in that bag, in your room, in your environment, in your outdoor container, is you're getting a living, dynamic soil system that has tens of thousands of species of biology and fungi, which will outcompete things like Fusarium, Pythium, things that you get on like commodity cocos that you buy that have been manufactured and packaged in, India or wherever, outdoors in the environment, or whether it's a soil that's made outdoors. All of those products have negative and positive biology in them. And it's just a matter of, do they have enough diversity to outcompete the negative pathogenic biology and fungi? So that's the question. That's why often you'll see with, say, commodity cocoa blocks, when you hydrate them and you bring them into a room that's warm and humid, you get a fungal or a mold growth on the outside of that bag. That's because there's nothing there to eat that or outcompete it. And that's where a diverse biological media really works.
Well, I think that's super, super important for business to business, because a lot of these licensed farms, they can't afford to have those kind of problems, because some of those guys are harvest to harvest at this point. And so bringing in pests and pathogens is a good way to kill your brand. So I think the extra steps that you guys do to ensure that is something very attractive as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
So you talked about a few different materials that you're using in your soil. You mentioned biochar, there's peat moss, and some others. Can you talk about how you source those materials? How do you make sure that you're doing those things in a sustainable way, or at least you're getting it from a place that's has access to this stuff for a long time? What kind of work have you guys done on that end?
Well, I mean, firstly, I just want to acknowledge that, it's really hard, virtually impossible to source sustainable peat. I mean, harvesting peat bogs is not a sustainable activity at all. I don't know that in the history of humanity that it ever has been. Maybe 2 centuries ago as it was, but it's not any longer. And, as much as we would like to move away from utilizing peat, we have reduced a lot of peat in our media by utilizing cocoa coir. Now, that said, we do bring our cocoa coir from places like the Dominican Republic and Sri Lanka. So there's a carbon footprint that goes along with that. I think in a global economy, it's pretty hard to reduce I mean, you definitely we could attempt to reduce that carbon footprint more by sourcing material from, say, Mexico or somewhere else, but then we're trucking it overland. We ship our soil from New York to the West Coast, so there's a carbon footprint there. I mean, we could get really deeply into it, and as with a lot of, say, biochar aficionados, they don't want to ship their biochar out of state because of the carbon footprint that's associated with it. Well, realistically, as a company, we can't do that right now. So in terms of peat, as a sustainable resource, I don't think peat is ever going to be a sustainable resource. And the sooner that we as a community can move away from utilizing peat, the better. That said, there aren't a lot of affordable peat alternatives out there at the present time. There are some, but they're just not economically viable. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges for everybody in the industry is the peat is still very cheap. And until that changes, probably we'll see peat being used in horticultural media, for a longer period of time. The biggest challenge with peat is that when you take it out of the ground, it's a carbon sink. So you're releasing all that carbon into the atmosphere as it breaks down. That does take time. You're also destroying habitat, and neither of those things are good. So I don't make any claims to be exceptional in that department.
Well, while we're on that subject, what are you guys burning up to make biochar?
So the biochar that we get is a byproduct of the forestry industry. So when the forestry industry cuts down a tree and mills it and turns it into lumber, they put it in a kiln to dry it. Now, what they burn in those kilns is softwood leftovers. So like shavings and things that have been used in the process of creating the lumber itself. So it's all virgin softwood biochar. So they take those cuttings and they put it into the kiln. The kiln is run at a high temperature with no oxygen, and the byproduct is biochar. Okay. So that's where our biochar comes from. It's a byproduct of the Northwest forestry industry, and it's high temperature, low ash biochar. It's very consistent, and it's something that we've worked a long time to maintain consistency with.
Great. So we're coming up on the last 15 minutes of the show or so. So we're gonna go into BioFlower, but as we I think maybe a good way to get into BioFlower would be if you could just talk me through. We have a lot of folks that are home growers that listen to the show or watch the show. So can you walk someone through how they should use your products? So I'm starting in the BioStart, which sounds awesome, by the way. And then I up pot to maybe a BioAll. And then could you walk me through that through these things? That'll just help me understand how I'm using all this stuff together.
So, are you growing autoflowers or are you using clones?
Let's say this is like a seed or a clone.
Okay, so if you were starting with a seed or a clone, honestly, I would start it straight in the BioFlower. I wouldn't go through a process of germinating in a smaller container or anything like that. I'd set up my tent or my room. I'd set up the container that I wanted to use, and I'd germinate it directly in that container. Now, being said, if you wanted to accelerate things, you could do it in a smaller container because you can force the root growth in that faster. But I would just use less water in a larger container. So if I was growing, say, autoflowers in a tent, I would have a 5-gallon container of BioFlower. It could be a 5-gallon grow bag. It could be a container that I get myself, depending on how much I know about the root system of an autoflower and all of the things that go into that. Then I put my BioFlower in, I'd put the seed in there, I'd give a light irrigation, and I'd germinate that, and then I would just leave it. And I would get a tensiometer, and I'd stick the tensiometer between the plant and the wall of the container, and I would just watch that tensiometer. And I wouldn't irrigate that until it got somewhere to around 60 kPa. And then I would give an irrigation, and then I would just watch the tensiometer again. And that's like a foolproof way of knowing that the plant is getting everything that it needs, because BioFlower has an enormous amount of nutrient available to it. It has about 8% biochar, which is a lot of biochar. So there's a lot of water and nutrient held in that biochar. And I would be completely confident that if I used that tensiometer, that plant would grow to fruition. And then later on, when the plant got larger, I could think about if I wanted to do some additional nutrient application or some top dressing, but I wouldn't necessarily do that. I could do water only in a 5-gallon BioFlower container. If you've got something that's going to run about 10 or 11 weeks, for sure. I know people who have taken our BioFlower and done 13-week water-only runs with them, 5-week veg, and then an 8-week, 9-week flower. You can do that for sure. I think if it's for your head stash, you would have great product. You might not get exactly the massive yield that you want, but as a low cost solution and an easy solution to growing it's ideal.
I would agree with that. And I did a full 9-week run in 10-gallon pots, and I documented every week.
Yeah.
If you go on my channel, and that was water only, with the exception of I used Recharge, which is a microbial product.
Yeah.
I used that one up to week 5, and I used Mammoth P.
Yeah.
Shout out to Mammoth P. I used that all the way up to week 7.
Yeah.
And then I also in week 5 and 6 gave it a bloom booster.
Interesting.
And I got to tell you, it was a phenomenal run. It was right after I had back surgery. So for my wife to be able to just go in and pretty much give it water only, because what I would do is I would do water, then I'd do that microbial punch,
Right.
water, punch. And so it just made a very simple solution. And it really kind of turned me on to the quality and the resin production that you get out of the living soil option. And I have been growing this cherry paloma for 4 or 5 years now, and I know how it acts and when it's good and when it's really good. Yeah. And I got to say, the stickiness, the terps, and the quality of the flower was amazing for the little amount of input that I really had to do. It was really phenomenal.
Yeah. And, I would really encourage people to do some research on the history of cannabis and where the plant came from, because if you look at it historically as a plant, it's a marginal plant. It comes from areas where it doesn't really get a lot of water or a lot of nutrients. So it's a very thrifty plant when it comes to working out what it needs to do. And the biggest challenge, I think, for people who grow is doing too much, wanting to give too much to that plant because they love it and they think it's extraordinary and amazing. And, it's an incredible survivor. When you think about, say, a lot of the genetics that come from the Hindu Kush Mountains, I mean, they're high, dry, bright, very arid environments. And, the plants that come from that are very used to being very dry. And that's how those terpenes and cannabinoids get expressed, is through the plant really having to search hard and dig deep in its genetic spectrum for expression.
I know from personal experience doing guerrilla grows, those plants sometimes that you can't quite get to, and they just got to figure it out. They may not be the biggest producers, but sometimes the color the genetic expression is phenomenal. It's amazing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've played around, like just going back to BioCoCo, when I just played around with growing in the 1.25 gallon bags. You can get a full-size plant in that bag that's big, and you can let it really dry that bag down in late flower and just watch the resin build on the flowers, even though there's nothing really available in the bag. I mean, it's got a little bit of water, it's got some residual nutrient, but it is just really sucking everything out of that soil, out of that cocoa. And, probably commercially, people wouldn't want to do that because they'd be afraid that they'd lose their crop or they can't be there all the time to handle it. And there's truth to all of that, but it's really amazing how versatile the cannabis plant is.
So you've got me very intrigued. So should I, like I was saying earlier, a lot of our, fans in our audience are home growers and tents. So just to make sure that I totally understood what you just said, should I start in a 3 or a 5 gallon? And because like a lot of us might, speaking for myself, at least, I have a 3x3 tent,
Right.
And so I'm just thinking, like, should I start each plant in a 3x3 in BioFlower and like call it a day, basically? Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, that's basically what I'm saying. I mean, it's a little bit dependent on, what are you trying to do with your soil over time? Are you wanting to reuse it, or are you just using a 3 gallon or a 5 gallon container and then restarting each round?
Yeah.
I mean, some people like to get creative. They use like a 60 gallon container and they put a little cover crop in there and they do a whole lot of things like that. And it's totally fun. You can totally do that. I think what's great about 3 and 5 gallon containers is you have a little more control over the dry back. So you can be really a little more forceful if you want to, like definitely between a 3 and a 5. If you're wanting to be more forceful with your dry backs, go with a 3 gallon because you've just got 2 gallons less media. And, the plant's going to fill that root zone out. You're going to get the plant that you get in terms of size, especially with auto flowers. They're going to grow as big as the container and no more. And so I would just sort of, do your own research around those kind of things, how those things influence the plant that you get at the end. But I definitely have seen people grow great big plants in a 5 gallon of BioFlower and do 13-week, water only.
So
And
cool.
yeah, and the plant is never going to say no to more biology. For sure. If you use Mammoth P, you're really helping that plant obtain phosphorus out of the media. And one of the things about biological systems in soils is the more biology, the more access and ways the plant has to get the biology, to get the nutrient out of the soil. So you can kind of never have too much biology. I mean, we put a lot in there, but you can always add more.
So you mentioned there, in terms of people's strategies, you mentioned re-amending or reusing the soil. So
Yeah.
is that can I do that with BioFlower? How do I do
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a little hard because you're never really going to know what the soil is missing. You're never really going to know what it
Right.
needs unless you send that soil off for testing. Now, the test is probably going to cost you more soil. So you're never really going to do that. So generally what I would say is you can sort of assume that the plant has used a general amount of nutrient and that you need to amend it. I understand that if you're going to grow a long plant in a 5 gallon bag, that you probably really want to put a good amount of nutrient into it. So that might mean get a general purpose nutrient and start amending that soil as soon as the plant is done. Maybe you put that container aside and you grow in a new container. I know people who do that. So they'll cycle their containers through. They'll grow in one, and then the other container they'll set aside and add nutrient to and allow that nutrient to digest over the period that they're flowering in the other container, and it's just in the back of their tent. So it kind of acts like a natural cycling system in that way. But yeah, it's always really hard to know exactly with re-amending containers for reuse how much to put in, what's going to be available, how do you get that to be available in a reasonable amount. I mean, I think the thing you really have to think about is phosphorus, because phosphorus is hard to deliver to plants. Not like nitrogen. You can get liquid forms of nitrogen all day long and it's really easy. Phosphorus, you've really got to have it cycled and available to the plant in a bioavailable form. So I'd be thinking about, how do I do that? And maybe how do I do that while the plant is still growing in order for the next run? It's not ideal, but as I said, having two separate containers that you kind of switch between is another good way to achieve that.
I like that idea of, I think about, it's like for every gallon of BioFlower, I'm feeling like 2 weeks of nutrition.
Yeah.
So if you're in a 5 gallon container, I think it's going to be a little more forgiving, especially for maybe a newer home grower.
Yeah.
And you're going to guarantee you get that 9 to 10 week cycle that you're looking for and getting the push out of it that you want.
Absolutely. Yeah. I agree too. I think bioflowers are really good, just a great simple soil for growing anything in, really, whether you're growing, tomatoes or peppers or any other things you want to grow. It's great for all of those plants that are kind of hungry producers.
So what kind of R&D are you guys able to do? I mean, I know your soil is, went into outer space,
Yes.
or at least our, almost outer space.
Yeah.
But anyways, can you kind of talk about some of the R&D stuff you guys do and how you have noticed some of the genetic expression differences and stuff?
Well, we don't do so much R&D anymore. We did that a lot earlier on in the beginning, and it wasn't really the area that I was involved in. So it's hard for me to speak directly to it. A lot of what I did on the farm in Sonoma was really looking at how BioAll, for example, performed against other soils on the market that were allegedly sort of similar in terms of their nutrient holding capacity, and just seeing how long they actually lasted in water-only trials and things like that. So some of the things we're doing now is we are looking at additional grow media lines to add to our system that are different from the ones we have now. I can't really talk directly about those, but we do that. We do a lot of in-house testing of different types of coco coir. We're always looking at ways that we can improve the quality of the grow media that we produce, and while maintaining consistent supply chains, because we recognize that really since COVID, supply chain has become a pretty serious issue. So we're always looking to make sure that we have access to the right kinds of cocoa, right kinds of perlite, and then ways in which we can improve our manufacturing production, whether that's improving the speed or the consistency of the product, and how different types of media and substrates affect that. So that's really the sort of the short answer for the R&D. And if you wanted to talk to John Gaunt, who's our chief science officer, he would definitely be someone to have on the program to talk more deeply about R&D, because that's really his scene.
Awesome. I'm always excited about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming up on the very end of the episode, but before I let you both go, I think we should just have JR. Are there any other like pro tips that you can drop? Or I guess obviously Sebastian as well, because you're the expert that we have on the show. But I know there's a lot of fans of ours that see JR's grow and the success that he's had. And JR was dropping some other little tidbits. So just before we end the episode, any other tips that you guys have? Or JR, I guess I'll let you go first.
I will say, if you're a person who's doing staging where you're going from certain sizes to bigger sizes, like for me in my veg space, I have to utilize as much of the space as I can. So I'm in 2 gallon pots. And I find the BioAll is a very good solution for that. And I've even moved to the 3 gallon fats for the BioAll because that's going to give me all the nutrition I need to get that to that 5 week mark so that I can then transplant into the BioFlower, which is going to give me my full 9 to 10 weeks in my 10 gallon pot, no problem. And that's the other thing is I wanted to mention when I did have that success, I did the BioFlower in a 10 gallon pot. And I was starting out my waterings at about half a gallon. And then within, I would say about 6 to 7 days, they were rocking and wanting a full gallon, every 4 days for 4 to 5 days for a while. Then that kind of shrinks. And I think that's the thing that people need to watch is they may assume, oh, hey, I only got to water this every 4 or 5 days, in the beginning. But when you start hitting week 7 and stuff like 6 and 7, man, that guy's like water, day off, water, day off, water. And so those watering strategies, I think, are the things that people need to, get used to and kind of dial in. And once you get that dialed in, like I said, you could look on my page and see, how beautiful those flowers turned out.
Awesome. So I guess the one thing that I would give as a tip is, do some research around tensiometers and look at, there's a company called Aerometer and they make agricultural tensiometers. They've been around for about 60 years. Getting one of those in your grow is just a really great way to understand how tension watering works. And Blue Mat make a system where they use a tensiometer. It doesn't have a dial on the top, so you don't really know. You can set it at different tension levels. So that's one system. But getting a tensiometer that you can really understand and exploring that a little bit and understanding what's actually happening in the soil when the plant's drawing water up, I think that's a great way to more fully understand how the plant operates.
And for me, what I did strategy-wise for the room, I had 17 of the 10 gallon pots. What I did is I did the blue moths, and I used the one that I noticed was kind of drinking, not the most, but not the least. And that was the pot that I used that in. And that was kind of my gauge to get through my watering cycles. But yeah, shout out blue moths.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. We really, really appreciate it. This has been really cool. If folks have been listening or watching and they want to learn more, they should go to bio365.com. Up in the top navigation, there's a Find Us button. You click that. There's the store locator page that I mentioned earlier. Any other kind of shout outs or things that people should check out?
If people want to have questions and want to reach out to me directly on Instagram, they can reach out to me at bio365_Sebastian. So they can send questions there. I'm always happy to answer questions, and they can reach out through the website or to the main Bio365 page too. But yeah, good luck, everybody. Good growing.
Thanks. And do you got any events or anything that you're excited about coming up?
I just have a lot of personal travel for the company to Missouri and other places like that. I don't have events until next year. Indoor AgCon, that's not cannabis specific. It's food and other controlled environment ag. And then in March, we have NECAN Boston. So that's the next big show we're going to be at. So that should be fun. Looking forward to that for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today. If folks enjoyed this episode, they should make sure to like and subscribe, the like button, or leave a comment below. That helps spread the episode. We'll do a giveaway to our viewers after the episode's done. We'll give that pack of seeds to someone in our chat. But as always, JR,
growers love.
Peace, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.